Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Markos Kounalakis.
All right, well, welcome. We've got quite a panel for you today. It's Data and Democracy, the Norm of Transparency, and we've got a dynamic group, the bios of whom you've got in front of you, so I won't, during the introductions, go through their long list of accomplishments and their organizational affiliations, but whether you are a philanthropist seeking to advance field-wide learning, a human rights activist working to ferret out abuse, a corporate CEO wishing to build consumer confidence and employee pride, whether you're a nonprofit leader promoting collaboration and impact, an advocate seeking to persuade, or a democratic leader seeking to govern effectively, transparency is the means to an important end. And that's what we'll be focusing on today, is the question of transparency. In this panel, we'll hear from these activists, human rights investigators, journalists, data nerds and data aggregators who believe that openness is an imperative if liberal democracy and cohesive society are to succeed. And the first person we'll be speaking with this morning is Patrick Alley, who is the co-founder and director of Global Witness. Patrick.
Thank you, Markos. What I'd like to do is talk about, we'll try and put some context on this based on some examples from our work. What we tend to do is to look at corruption issues in resource-rich countries. It's not exclusively what we do, but that's largely what we do. Why is it that some of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources, like Myanmar or the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, are in fact amongst the most autocratic, unstable, and poor? And I want to talk just a little bit about how transparency makes corrupt deals harder to do, and making it harder for money laundered from corrupt deals to be laundered. So I just want to give a couple of examples by way of context. We released a report just yesterday talking about one of the vice presidential candidates in Indonesia's upcoming election on the 17th of April, Sandiaga Uno, and how he acquired a coal company called Berau Coal, and looking at how $43 million was transferred from that company to another company called Velodrome, based in the Seychelles. No one knows who owns Velodrome. We have our ideas, and he might be running for office in Indonesia. And another deal, something we've been looking at now for probably 8 years. Nigeria has been enjoying an oil boom for the last half century, slightly more. 80% of Nigerian people live on less than $2 a day. It's one of the poorest countries in the world in that regard. How can that be possible? And it's because of corruption. And we've looked at one particular deal by the oil majors Shell and the Italian state oil company Eni, who paid a $1.1 billion bribe to get hold of one of Nigeria's richest offshore oil blocks. That oil block was owned by a company called Malibu Oil and Gas, and it turned out that company was owned by the then oil minister at the time, who had awarded himself the block. Those deals happened. Various players in that Nigerian case are now in court. But obviously, transparency, as embodied in one law we and our various NGO allies managed to get onto the US statute books, was Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which required all oil and mining companies in the world who are listed on the Securities and Exchange Commission to declare what they pay to the governments of the countries they work in. It was one of the first laws, if not the first law, that Trump neutralized when he came in shortly after Rex Tillerson became Secretary of State. I'm sure that's a coincidence, but that law was a very powerful thing. And then just to finish my introduction, where does the money go? Again, we produced another report recently. There are 87,000 properties in the United Kingdom worth around £56 billion that are owned by companies of which we do not know who the beneficial owners of those companies are. We've exposed cases in the past where the son of Colonel Gaddafi had a £10 million house in Hampstead. The National Crime Agency recently investigated the case of Zamira Hajiyava, the wife of a corrupt Azeri banker, and her £11.5 million apartment in Knightsbridge. You know, places like London, like New York, like Paris are havens for money laundering, and we're working along with our allies to get European Union legislation to force the foreign owners of those companies to declare who they are. Just to finish off, when we're looking at these countries that are having their resources stripped from them, you know, this goes to the heart of democracy, and all of this stolen loot washing into, you know, our capitals, United Kingdom, whatever, also undermines our democracy. Crime is sitting there. You know, you could be the next door neighbor of a criminal.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. And that's, I think we'll look a bit more at this question of what is often commonly referred to as the resource curse, and how countries such as Nigeria are rife for corruption when there are these natural resources that are so valuable. And also, I think this question of real estate as assets for laundering of funds and other types of means for transferring illegally gotten funds. We'll turn now to Giannina Segnini, who is the director of the Masters of Science Data Journalism program at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, my alma mater. Giannina.
Thank you, Marcus. I think I want to start to talk about how I discovered the power of data 20 years ago, when data was not like a big issue. I've been working as an investigative reporter for the last 25 years, 30 years, and I was doing regular investigative reporter, like, you know, approaching sources, as you see in the movies, you know, secret meetings and all that kind of stuff. And it was very frustrating because I was always depending on sources, whistleblowers, or people who wanted to share something with you. And then I saw the budget. This is back in Costa Rica. I'm Costa Rican. I saw the national budget, and there was money to finance subsidy, a governmental subsidy for homeless people, and there was a document saying that there were 200,000 homeless people in the country, which, of course, there weren't. I mean, there's no way you can see all these people. It was not the reality at that time. So we asked for the list. We had to go to court. We got the list. That's how we called data back in the days. And we used an Excel thing, and we started cross-referencing this list of people with other databases. I remember I had to use like a big computer. And what we found is that many people had up to 25 properties and salaries, and they were not homeless. So they were using this program as a political weapon, pretty much. And so when we published, that was astonishing because the president congratulated us, and that never happens. And then I was, after the investigation, I was thinking, you know, this thing is really powerful, because imagine, if I had done it in a traditional way, let's say that a taxi driver tells me that there are 3 people who got subsidies and they don't deserve the subsidies. And if I go and talk to the administrator and say, hey, these people are getting subsidies that they're not supposed to get, what he would say is, oh, yeah, we're going to fix it. And those are the only ones who have the problem. So with data, you can see the complete universe, and that's amazing, because it's not just facts, it's understanding broader realities. Now I'm leading the data journalism program and also a cross-border investigative team at Columbia, and we're working with partners. A couple of years ago, we did a totally different exercise. We collected more than 125 variables on Donald Trump's business deals across the planet to try to understand the business model. And we succeeded because the use of data allowed us to, for instance, find out that he does not invest a penny, he does not build anything, none of these deals, he didn't take care of any of those. He just gets paid up front to use his name. So those are licensing agreements. But more than that, we were able to see how many criminals were surrounding those deals, and not just see, but prove it. And also, the way the business works. And it's pretty much, he first sends his children. Actually, the data we were almost close to prove that when he sends Ivanka, the deal is more likely to happen. And if he sends Eric, it doesn't really work out. So all those things you can learn from the use of data. So to me, that's transparency, because data is not just, fragments of information. Data is useless if you don't use it, in a way to try to understand broader problems. And just to end my presentation, I wanted to talk about the project I'm working on right now, and it's about churches and money laundering. There's probably no better way to launder money than through a church. And here in the US, you can declare yourself as, I can start the church of the speaker, and I don't need to register anything in the IRS. So we're gonna try to apply the same methods to understand, how this phenomenon works. Thanks.
Very good. So Giannina, and it's important that you point out that you've worked as an investigative journalist. One of the challenges today is, as the journalism business model collapses, the two most expensive aspects of journalism, traditional institutional journalism, has been, on the one hand, foreign corresponding, but on the other hand, it's been investigative journalism. So there is a challenge today just on the type of work that you and your colleagues have done, and perhaps we can talk about that in a bit as well. John Githongo is next, and he is the CEO of Inuka Kenya Trust. John.
Thank you very much. I think I'll segue on what has already been said and just add a bit of context vis-a-vis the whole issue of transparency and democracy, and focus quite specifically on a trend that is quite new. By 2006, 2008, through the highly indebted Poor Countries Initiative, the debt of about 36 countries, 30 of them in Africa, had been written off. Countries like Ghana that had 120% of GDP in debt. In 2000, it went down to about 12% in 2006, and that was replicated across the African continent. Now, in the last 10 years, the debt to GDP ratios have doubled again. The trend that we thought we had resolved is back. And the big difference now is that the debt that is being accumulated, now it's over half $1 trillion, is heavily commercial debt. And a lot of it being acquired by government in extremely opaque ways, both from the West, the commercial debt that is not Chinese is usually acquired under British law, under common law, 90% of it. And it's acquired opaquely in ways that ordinary citizens don't have access to the very basic information of it. The people of Mozambique woke up to discover that their government had borrowed $2 billion from the commercial markets in Europe. As a result, we are seeing a series of debt distress and defaults across sub-Saharan Africa. They talk about Djibouti, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Angola, Madagascar, Congo, Chad, Zimbabwe. Kenya is also being mentioned as a risk. This poses a risk not only to our democracy, but to basic livelihoods, because the repayment of commercial debt is taken out of increased taxes to ordinary citizens. And so one of the things that we've been pushing hard for, and fortunately, and it's belated, but both IMF and World Bank and other multilateral institutions seem to have woken up to this over the last 18 months, is for there to be a lot more transparency with regard to the acquisition of commercial debt across Africa, and for there to be transparency also in the arbitration and negotiation when countries go into debt distress, and for there to be clauses that stop vulture funds from predating on those countries that have gone into distress. Credit Suisse has launched a transparent lending covenant. So there's a recognition within the service sector that puts together the infrastructure for these for this debt, that there's a problem coming. And so I wanted to put this on the table, and it's how important it is for the sustaining of democracies that are still developing across Africa, and the risk this debt poses as we are sitting here right now.
Thank you, John. I think that's a really key issue. Is we often read about debt trap and the ability of other nations to then indenture, in essence, these other countries, the question of whether that's a neo-colonial type of activity, but the question of commercial debt is really what's new here, and the ability to get that transparency and to get at that number, those numbers, should be much more accessible. And we'll see how that affects democracy as well. The next speaker is Chris Taggart, who is the co-founder and CEO of Open Corporates.
Thank you. I co-founded Open Corporates 8 years ago with a simple goal, and it was the idea that companies were really important to the world. They were fundamental to the world we live in today. And the information about them, public information about them, information in company registers, Secretary of State registers, in filings and things like this, should be freely and openly available to everybody. This was before the Panama Papers. This was before we knew about 1MDB. This was before we knew about Danske Bank. This was before we knew about how companies were being used to buy political advertising and so on. But nevertheless, I knew. I mean, my background's as an entrepreneur, and well, originally a journalist, and I ended up running magazine companies and had my own magazine company. But I knew the world that most people see is not the reality, and I think this is one of the fundamentals about transparency and democracy, and one of the real critical issues. And when you're talking about the commercial debt, people are living their lives and have no idea that this commercial debt has been taken on, but they suffer the consequences. And they're not involved. And actually, where does this money go? Often this money has just disappeared, using companies to salt away the proceeds in safe countries, in the US, in the UK, in Canada, in property and other sorts of things. But you know, we used to have this idea, and most people, if you ask them what a company was, they sort of in their mind have this idea of a factory or a shop or some sort of service and so on, delivering goods. But it's never really been quite that, and it certainly hasn't been that for a long way. I mean, what we're talking about is a legal construct that has a legal personality, and that is a sort of like a hack. It's a hack that allows you to transfer assets from one to another, to do to engage into contracts and so on. And that's why something like Goldman Sachs has whatever 8,000-9,000 different entities in it, because there's benefits from doing that. And I think that this idea, you know, there were two things in my mind when we did it, which weren't as clear as they are now. But one was the dataization of the world. The world is becoming data. In fact, it's data. I mean, when was the last time that you had that almost that quaint interaction with a printed piece of paper called a map, and looked at that, a one-on-one interaction with an inanimate object? Now what is happening is that we are not just, it's not just about data on one of these when we use Google Maps or City Map or something like that. It's the, you know, and this data is not coming from Google, it's coming from somebody else who's coming from someone else, and coming and aggregated with hundreds of different contracts behind this sort of stuff in a way that we don't understand. And your data is going the other direction. But it's also a thing which was a personal, private transaction, private experience, has become a transaction, a commercial transaction. And so much of our lives now is becoming a commercial transaction, and it's going to become even more so. And so this idea of what companies are and the role they play in the world, if you like, that's the ground truth. And it's now sort of bubbling through. We're seeing it with Panama Papers. We're seeing it with the money laundering scandals. We're seeing it with companies being used to buy election advertising on Facebook. And I think it's a little bit shocking that Facebook hasn't really done anything actually about this. The consequences of and acknowledging that the consequences of not understanding what companies exist, not understanding who's behind them, what they do, who they're controlled by, where the money comes from, is actually a fundamental breakdown of our democracy. So I think that this idea about transparency. And I don't just mean transparency, you can look at something, but transparency in a data world means you can look at something, you can do something with it, you can touch it, you can combine this data, you can analyze it, you can find anomalies and so on. This is what transparency truly means in the modern world. Obviously, because of open corporates, I'm particularly focused on transparency of companies. But I think in general, I don't believe we can have true democracies in a data-led world without proper access to that data. And I don't believe we can also have trust. And one of the saddened things I think about where we are with democracy at the moment is how many people are losing trust in democracy as well. And I think that's a direct consequence of this almost instinctive sense that they don't understand the world, but that the world has got rules within it which don't work for them, but they're working for somebody else. And I think that that's one of the things we strongly need to fight, not just to making a better society, but to give people faith back in democracy.
Right. And there's this understanding, I think, and maybe it's a false understanding, that the more open the society, the more democratic the society, the more available and transparent the data. But what you're saying is that there are layers and layers of ways of hiding, even within a transparent, open, democratic society, these types of data. And maybe we can look at this as well as we get into the
absolutely. And I think that sort of I mean, it would be great to go on a later we get on to getting to what we think the world is, what the world really is, and also more importantly, the thing that I think we all find scary is the speed of change of the world as well, and where we will be in 5 years and 10 years' time as well.
Right. Well, if there's somebody who can talk about the speed of change and technological development, it's certainly Esther Dyson, but I'm sure you're going to talk about some other things as well. Esther is the she's the executive founder of Wellville. Esther.
Which means we have a CEO, but I work full-time.
Yes.
So just interestingly, in the interests of transparency, there's something that's not a secret, but you might not all know, and it is somehow relevant, which is that the 5 of us here are all trustees of open corporates. But the reason we're all here is precisely because we're not redundant. And what I'd like to do very briefly, so I used to be a fact checker for Forbes back when they had fact checkers. I was on Wall Street, and so I'm totally in sync with what everybody said, but I wanted to add a couple of interesting points about transparency and data. And to do that, I want to echo Charles Koch yesterday, hate the sin, not the sinner, but I still am going to ask a question about Donald Trump. And that question is, of all the people in the United States, who understands his mindset the least, not the most, but the least, when he gets up at 2 a.m. and tweets? And the answer, of course, is Donald Trump himself. And part of the importance of transparency is not just being aware of what other people are doing, but being aware of what you yourself are doing, whether you're an individual or a community or a country. That ability, not just for the transparency to exist, but for people to make use of it, to actually have the, if you like, the courage, the self-awareness to understand what's happening and how they themselves are being manipulated either by their own pasts or perhaps by corporations and governments. And so when you look at big data, one of the dangers of big data is how much easier it makes it to manipulate people. And here we're focusing more on governments, but I think a lot of things we say about governments now apply to corporations because they have so much power over us. They can't put us in jail, but they can make us make stupid decisions all the time about, you know, how many of you ate the muffins rather than the healthy fruit? And, you know, it's that ability to see the data that's really important. On the other hand, individuals and communities can look at their own data and make good changes. The other thing I think worth noting about data and transparency is how much both the ability to collect data and make predictions, but also to understand counterfactuals gives philanthropists the power to do things like social impact investing, to say you might not be able to get an actual return on something directly, but you can see the return in terms of healthier people, higher productivity for the economy, to go back to government and say perhaps we should do some collective spending for this, that, or the other. But ultimately, understanding how the world works, which we do better with data, enables us to think more long-term and, again, manipulate ourselves out of doing the short-term gratifying thing, whether it's collecting votes, making quarterly profits, or eating unhealthy food.
So self-awareness, an understanding of perhaps the manipulation of this big data and how it affects us in our daily lives, but also in the decisions that we're making at a corporate level in terms of the investments and the like. And this is all very interesting food for thought here, but we've got a lot of different topics and a lot of different frames that we've presented. Is there anyone who would like to question another on the panel here as we look at these various questions, whether it's the investigative reporting aspect or the self-awareness concept?
I guess, I mean, I'm hugely in awe of the work that John, I mean, if people don't know John's work, and there's a fantastic book called It's Our Turn to Eat, but so I highly recommend that. I mean, hugely in awe, well, and all of our trustees, and including Jane, who's also on. But John, I mean, in terms of, you know, what is actually happening in something like where there is where there's, you know, a debt issue? What is the you know, just maybe you could just talk through the process where there's, you know, a commercial, you know, debt purchase, you know, sell to commercial lenders and so on, and that then where does the money go, and how does the opacity enable this? And I think the same could be said of something like 1MDB as well. I mean, it's not an unrelated case. And what is how does that trickle down to people's lives in the end?
Well, put quite simply, in a real case scenario, a group of individuals from New York, or London, or etc. I call them, you know, the architects, you know, financial experts, bankers, lawyers, accountants, come together, walk into a country, go into the Ministry of Finance, and say, listen, you know, there's so much more you can be doing, and we can, you know, your economy is doing very well, and you know, it can do even better with a $2 billion commercial loan that we can organize for you. A prospectus is developed that pushes that narrative. Officials fly out. Negotiations are held. Even the prospectuses that are being put together by governments are not necessarily open to the citizens or even the parliaments of the countries that are then acquiring this debt. This paper is acquired, the paper is floated in New York or London or wherever until the government opens accounts in major banks in those countries, and some of the money trickles back. The issue, the problem comes when repayment time arrives, and just giving the case of Kenya and a whole range of the countries that I listed, small, very painful things begin to happen that affect the poorest in society. So, for example, VAT is imposed on all products. So the price of kerosene, which the poor, urban poor in particular, use to cook, goes up. The price of sanitary pads, everything is paid for by ordinary citizens. And this is how we feel the actual pain of making these dollar-denominated payments for this commercial debt, which is very difficult to renegotiate. It's one thing owing money to the European Development Bank, African Development Bank, but here we owe it to very faceless, opaque entities that are convoluted and difficult to understand even for experts in the home country. But ultimately, except for the countries with extractive industries, with oil or gold, for others, you tax the poor to pay these debts. And the people, the entities that you're paying to are completely unapologetic, and they really don't care. That you just, as I said, it's only now in the last really 18 months the one sense is that IMF has woken up late to it, World Bank as well, that realize this is a crisis that's coming, and we are about to see a number of serious defaults that will have political, social, and economic implications over the next couple of years.
And something like Mozambique, I was going to say, in Mozambique and so on, was this consciously done as a way of transferring wealth to private individuals, or was it unconsciously?
I think Mozambique, a couple of $1 billion. No one was told about it. Parliament wasn't told. It was supposed to fund a tuna fishing fleet. They have very, very rich fishing grounds off the coast of Mozambique. That's not what it went to. It went to a whole range of other things in the military, but it still had to be paid back. And so it forced the country into default. And again, it's ordinary citizens who are forced to foot that bill.
But
I just wanted to add something on the issue of debt.
This is Patrick.
This is Patrick. And debt forgiveness. We again looked at a case a few years ago on the Republic of Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, where the son of the president was the head of the state marketing arm of the state oil company, and he was siphoning off oil revenues. In fact, he was siphoning off oil and funding a very lavish lifestyle. So that country was part of the highly indebted poor country debt relief. But they're all the time accumulating more debt, because what they could pay the debt with, their own resources, they're not. They're siphoning it off very often. And that brings me to the other point, is the reason we found out about that case is because another sort of not very attractive aspect of this is a vulture fund bought the debt of that country. And so the debt becomes a commercial opportunity. It was in a way beneficial for us because the vulture fund gave us all of the information that we were able to publish, but that doesn't really necessarily make what they're doing a very good thing. So these are things that help keep poor countries poor, and transparency is a critical part of stopping that.
Esther, you wanted to jump in?
I mean, this is great, interesting to listen to, but at the same time, in a sense, what we're discovering is most of this stuff was known. And so in addition to the transparency, you need the courage to do something about it. Because I mean, I spent lots of time in Russia, and it's not that all these things are secret. It's that no one has the courage to deal with them, and maybe they hope the IMF will come in and fix things. But what do we do once we've done the investigative journalism, and then the problems persist?
Right, and the question is not just the courage, it's also the power, the enforceability to do something about it.
Well, sometimes you need the courage to do it, and then other people will follow you. But someone there needs to take that risk. I mean, like the people we heard from in the country that shall not be named, because we can't mention it.
And do we have some examples of where that courage has been shown and where the power has then been exerted to, in fact, counter and to confront this question of where we do have the data, where we have the transparency suddenly, or we understand the problem?
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, perhaps the Veterans Administration is a great example, both because it was such a clear problem for so long, and it took so long to fix it. I'm not sure it's totally fixed yet. This is basically corruption and bad service in the organization that serves soldiers.
But part of this is, and Giannina, I'm sure you'll have some examples of this. Being a journalist on the traditional way is about somebody, a leak, someone gives you a lead or something, and there's some anomaly that creeps up. The story of the investigation around 1MDB that we heard last night is an example of, you need somebody to be thinking about this and to be looking at it. It might be there, it might be hidden in plain sight. So many of the best journalists and the best stories in the world have been hidden in plain sight, but it's the signal to noise. There's something in there, but it's surrounded by all these other things. And just thinking about the debt issuance in something like that, I'm sure there was a public paper filed in a bond issuance, and there might be something in the SEC and so on. But unless you are, one of the things is because that in general, I mean, often many of these things are actually available to, but they're proprietary. They're available, you need to, buy them through Reuters or Bloomberg or something like that, and it's got proprietary license on it. It's disconnected, and fundamentally what that does is it silos it. It disconnects it from all the other stuff. It makes it difficult for somebody in country to be able to join the dots and to see this sort of stuff happening. I mean, I'd like to have you'd like to think that every time that there was a debt issuance by a bond offering or something like that in a country, that there would be a big story on the news about it, and people will be saying, what says is this going to be really used? Should we be raising $2 billion this way, and is this stuff going to be what the right use is for it? But so much of this stuff, and this is why the data angle is so fundamental, because it's what allows us to join the dots. And most of all the data that we have has been from public sources, from registers, but the stories that people have done, whether it's stories around Panama Papers, we had a Spanish minister resigned because there was some information which was always on Companies House in the UK, but no one, until it was on Open Corporates, until the Panama Papers came out, could connect those dots together. And because it was too difficult, you needed to know that there was a story. And I think that what we need here is so many different, and this is why democracy is genuinely under threat, is that we need so many things. We need the data. We need the data in a form that we can be connecting it with other data and on licenses that allows us to do this. We need journalists who are literate in data. We need journalists who are literate in data who are getting paid in order to be able to do these investigations. We need the data to be able to, we need the data and the tools and so on that allow this data to be connected so that people can see it, not when they dig down this hole and this hole and this hole and this hole, but it pops up and that they can see it without having to make an effort and so on. And so much what we're seeing today, and I think this is there's a relevance here in terms of the huge tech companies. The huge tech companies in many ways are not about doing something that's not been done before, but doing it on a scale and with a reduction of friction and with a power to do this that nobody else has. I mean, what you're really talking with the those ring fences, there's ring fences of access to data and the ability and the power, the computing, the patents, the skills to be able to do things with this. And I think we need to break down those silos, otherwise we get into a place where not only is it functioning no longer work, does democracy work, but people have just lost confidence in it.
Just want to add something about that, because
Yes, Giannina.
we hear a lot from consultants and experts that we need big data and technology to solve the problems. And I don't think that's enough. First of all, big data could be stupid data, so we need relevant data, not big data. And second, we need ideas, and also collaboration across disciplines, because one discipline is not sufficient right now to understand the complexity of the problems of this world. So, we've been trying to work with not only technical people, but also, now I'm working with archaeologists. I've worked with geographers. It's fascinating when you come up with a problem and try to understand it using data. And you realize that your knowledge or your expertise or even your skills or like 5 data scientists, that's not how you solve problems or how you understand it. So I think it's overrated, the idea that technology solves everything, and it's absolutely amazing to work with technology and be able to do this kind of discoveries by analyzing data and finding patterns that otherwise you wouldn't be able to see. But again, the human factor is it's interchangeable, and I'm glad to witness that every day.
I'm going to jump to Patrick, but I'm going to actually try to answer my own question earlier, which is where has there been this transformation and this move? And maybe, Esther, you can also respond to this. Estonia seems to have come out of this example of being under Soviet occupation and really being a captive state for many years. And today, if you go to Estonia, you will find that online is virtually everything you need to know about the country, from a request for proposals to every expenditure that's made, every public expenditure that's made, directly into this system that allows every citizen not merely to check and see, in fact, in a very transparent way, how government is functioning and where its coffers are being expended, but also allows them to do things like learn about their political engagement and participate in the voting system. So maybe we can talk about that, and then I want to go to you, Patrick, because you have something as well.
Yeah, well, just to,
Yes, Esther, if you can respond, then we'll go to Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, so I know the place quite well.
I'm sure.
And I would say it's much more a function of the culture than of the technology. The technology was a very useful tool, but it was far more the culture. And just to be candid, the thing about Estonia in particular is they felt that they had been occupied by Russia. They did not feel complicit in the past. They felt that now they were free to govern themselves, to do all these things that they saw happening around the world, which was to become transparent, to become well organized and efficient. They were the first place that had SMS parking, where you would register your car as parked through an SMS to the city parking system and so forth. They were also small enough you could do this with extreme density without having to have it done at great scale. So it was a confluence of positive factors that I wish could happen more broadly, but so they're definitely a model, but it would have been much harder in a much larger country, like, for example, Poland.
Right. So I hear in your answer not only transparency, but size matters, culture matters, and maybe the ability to change culture.
Yeah, and a strong leader committed to this.
And leadership matters.
Yeah.
All right, those are all really key and important factors. As we look at this question of whether transparency equals democracy or creates the conditions for continued or changing towards more democratic systems. Patrick.
Yeah, I think on that last point, it creates or helps the conditions to get to that point, because like in the case I described of Shell and Eni in Nigeria paying that bribe, if the American law I mentioned had been in place at the time that happened, they couldn't have done the deal that way. It would have been very, very difficult for them to do it. And if they did do it and get caught, there are already laws in place that could be used to punish that company, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example, and the equivalents in different countries. So I think laws are essential, and when we're looking at extractive industries, we're talking about one of the biggest industries on the planet. So this is, a crucial area. And if there are not the requisite laws on the statute books, we need to lobby to get those laws on the statute books. Advocate, as we say in the States, I think that's right. And I think that a critical part of this is transparency allows citizens to challenge their governments. And okay, that's much easier to do in the US or the EU, Estonia. But there's a coalition of NGOs which we co-launched along with Transparency International and others back in 2002 called Publish What You Pay, which is now 750 non-for-profit organizations across the world in, I think, 80-odd countries, mostly rich in natural resources, who are a very active and well-coordinated group to sort of press the governments to be transparent. And there's anti-corruption mechanisms like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which countries, unfortunately, are not obliged to join, so some of the worst countries don't, but if they do join it, they have to declare what they receive from natural resource revenues. The company has to have to declare what they pay, and civil society has a seat at the table to see if the numbers balance. And that's proved to be quite effective, although a long way from a panacea. But that kind of, those kind of ways of trying to sort of turn transparency into actually a very heavy tool to make sure that people obey the law.
I'm going to turn to Giannina, and then I'm going to come in as well. But Giannina, why don't you, are you responding directly?
Very quickly, want to say something, because we've been focused on talking about governments, and transparency is broader than that. So we need to talk about nonprofits as well, and how foundations and nonprofits have been used to send billions of dollars across borders to finance all sort of things. And that's hard to investigate because they don't need to, they're not accountable as governments should be. And other sectors, I mean, not just the private sector, again, even religious organizations. So I think when we talk about transparency, I mean, it's much broader than just keeping governments accountable. And there's so much to do in terms of regulating other fields.
So I wanted to touch on two things. One is the question of transparency and its role in preserving versus promoting democracy, and to what degree you feel that democracy promotion is a part of this transparency movement and need. And the second is the question of how this disparity between open societies versus closed societies works, because it seems oftentimes that when you aim at transparency, when you achieve transparency, it oftentimes undermines those very democratic structures that are susceptible to this type of transparency versus those closed societies where we don't necessarily have the data, where there are no feedback loops, where there is no democratic ability to then do something about that government or those institutions that function within those governments. It seems as if there's an unevenness in how transparency affects whether it's government or institutions. And maybe you could address either of this idea of democracy promotion, or perhaps this unevenness of application of transparency's effects.
Maybe I'll start. I mean, obviously, transparency is not a sufficiency at all. But I think it's ones where, and I think as well, you can, everything can be looking like it's going fine, but it's not. And gradually you're going off the path. You think you're going this way, and you're going off the path, and suddenly you realise you're in a swamp or whatever. And that's, in a sense, what I see as transparency is the thing that allows you to keep on the path or keep within the boundaries. you can see this is in what's happened in Brazil. I went to Brazil. In fact, I think I probably did the first speech or whatever presentation about open data for on companies in OGP, Open Government Partnership event in Brasilia, whatever, 7 years ago or something. And I remember meeting with the CGU then, the Controller General's unit, who were about anti-corruption. They'd done amazing work around networks and corporate structures and so on to plot corruption and so on, and there was not much they could do about it. They didn't have enforcement powers. They wanted company information in Brazil. They were desperate for company information in Brazil to be public, because they said that they needed it to be public to have people to understand, people to have feedback loops, to have something to counteract all of this stuff. Well, we've seen what's happened in Brazil. Endemic, massive corruption. And a complete loss of confidence in government and in the government structures there. And I think that's the sort of thing that's happening. I think to a certain extent we've seen the same here in the US. In terms of the opacity about where the influence is coming from and where the money is coming from, has actually gradually eroded the trust in the democracy. Then when you get transparency, it's not, oh, here you've got transparency. It's like, oh, here's one thing, here's another thing, and so on. And what that does is that actually that shining a light on one thing, but rather than creating it's a bit like to suddenly, you're in a street where none of the street lights work, and one of them suddenly, shines, and you realise that there's a dead body there, someone that's been mugged, and so on. What you need is the street lights to be working all the time, so you can walk down the streets in safety. And I think that most of the criticisms of transparency in this regard, not that anyone thinks it's a panacea, but I do think it is a requirement. Is this idea that when you suddenly get a little bit, either, usually because of a leak or something, then the lack of transparency that's been there all along, and what that's enabled, and the sort of the context and the fertile ground that's enabled for corruption, for organized crime, for all of those other things, suddenly becomes clear to people, and then that's when they lose faith.
Right, so streetlights operating all the time, everywhere. Esther and John.
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, it's sort of, there's this transition from an opaque society where people may believe in the fearless leader, they're not starving in the streets, and so they feel things are pretty good, and they actually vote for the leader. So in a sense, it's democratic, if you think democratic is only voting. But if you're, somebody, quote, enlightened, you think, well, people must know the truth. And in order to get there, you go through this valley of cynicism and corruption and often confusion and just fake news, don't trust anybody, they're all crooks. And then if you're lucky, maybe you come out on the other side having cleaned it up. But I think at this point, many, many places in the earth are kind of in this valley where they know things are wrong, but they feel powerless to fix them. And that's why, again, you need to overcome people's cynicism, and you need both courage and faith.
I love your optimism. John, and then Giannina.
I think I just wanted to make the point. So in the whole ecosystem of processes and that combine to make for democracy, especially in developing countries, is the critical importance of process transparency around elections. That I come from Kenya, and we felt Cambridge Analytica in 2012. That's where they road tested some of their techniques. They were involved in the election in 2013. They were involved in the Nigerian election in 2015. They were involved in the election here in the United States in 2016, and they were back in Kenya in 2017. And I think that one can't overrate just basically how important it is for there to be a level of transparency vis-a-vis these new actors that are brought in by elites to engage in electoral processes and to manipulate them in ways usually that undermine the very principles for which you're holding these events. And these are critical events. Sometimes when they go wrong, we say they're part of the world where you're one election away from being a refugee. And so they're particularly important. And I would reiterate the point that was made, that Giannina, you made. I always say you can't digitize integrity. There is no silver technological bullet that will solve this. So there's a great fad right now of excitement of digital voting, et cetera. If you give it to a bunch of crooks, they'll steal the election even better.
So lots of avenues for philanthropic engagement and involvement and investment.
Correct.
Let's quickly wrap it up with Giannina and Patrick as the last word, and then I'll thank you all for being here.
Yeah, very quickly, when I hear Patrick talking about all these NGOs working together, it's like music to my ears, because really, there's no possibility to understand what's going on in this planet if we don't do cross-border collaboration and cross-discipline. I can't say it enough. Those guys in New York who are the architects dealing with the dead, everywhere they are globalized and they're working together. So it's very frustrating when you see like great investigative journalists working. See, I was in this is the last example. I was in a panel in one of these global investigative meetings, and there was a panel about how China is buying countries, and I'd done an investigation about what happened in my country. Pretty much that the country switched from Taiwan to China, and the secret was what they received, the government. And so there were other African colleagues also talking about the same issue. And it turned out that so we went to court, we got the documents, and part of the prize was stadium. So when I mentioned the stadium, before the panel we were talking, and so the African journalists say, "Oh my goodness, yes, we also got a stadium," and so he had done more investigative reporting on the stadium, and he's telling me, yes, they even have a catalog. So all the poor countries' leaders go to China, they're well treated, and then they see the catalog. The stadiums. So it's like, what are we doing, like addressing these issues alone? That's it.
Patrick, why don't you take us to the last word? But I want to also just say how great it is that I know that all 5 of you are working together, and that you're bringing your passion and your insights into the open corporates world and into the society in general.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just want to get back to your point, and I'll end up on the open corporates point, about open societies and closed societies. I think that we in the West can sometimes be vastly over-smug on how open we think our societies are. The power of the oil industry and the mining industry is vast, and the speaker sitting here this time yesterday, Charles Koch, is emblematic of the use of money secretly to actually subvert democracy and get things going his way. And that's not a lone example. It happens in the UK, it happens in Europe. The positive aspect of this is that corruption is a globalized industry for that reason. There might be a corrupt deal in Kenya, but the bank is probably in Frankfurt or London or New York, and the lawyers that brokered it are in those cities as well. And the companies that disguise all this, these secretly owned companies, could be anywhere, but two of the biggest secrecy jurisdictions in the world, well, the US is the biggest. The UK was, we now have a public registry, but we're probably still up there somewhere. Which all brings me to the point, that's why open corporates work is so important, because, as we've rather glibly phrased it, anonymously owned companies are the getaway cars for crime and corruption. If we can shine a light on that, get the street lights going, then we make it much, much easier to tackle this issue.
Well, thank you all for participating today. Thank you all for your participation, and join me in thanking everyone.